In this lecture, we'll be doing a short primer on the AWS Management Console. One important thing to know is that this course will not be teaching you how to use AWS. Now, there are many reasons for this, but learning AWS in and of itself, even just the Management Console, could be an entire course. In fact, each of the modules we go through could even have their own courses and lectures. So this is just a lightweight primer to show us how to configure the bare minimum things that we need from this course. Now, throughout the course, you may hear me say that I actually will not be helping or assisting you with AWS-specific items. That is true outside of this primer. And the reason for that is you don't have to use AWS for this course. You can elect to do things locally by hand, or you can even use a different provider such as GCP or Azure. It's entirely up to you. However, the backend provider that I use in my demonstrations is AWS. So if you want to follow on one-to-one with the examples, this is the primer that you need to consider. If you don't intend on doing so and want to do things your own way, feel free. If that's the case, you probably don't need to watch the rest of this video, but you may learn a thing or two anyway about the AWS Management Console. So for starters, in a lot of the Terraform scripts, we reference a specific PIM file. This is our SSH key that we use to access the EC2 servers. Terraform needs this for two reasons. For starters, it needs a reference so that way it knows what key to associate with what system. And in some of our Terraform configurations, it actually needs to use the key so that way it can run scripts after installation. Now, configuring your PIM file within the AWS Management Console is actually super easy. All you have to do is visit your services and go to the EC2 services. From here, you can actually see everything associated with your EC2 instances. And remember, if you're here to look at your systems once you've spun them up in Terraform, you should probably go to US East 1. I believe that's the default in most of the configurations. It'll either be US East 1 or US East 2. You, of course, have complete and total control over this configuration, and this should be wherever you end up if you modify things. But I just wanted to make note of that if you spin up a box and you don't see it for some reason. So the way we configure SSH keys for our EC2 instances is actually under the key pairs option. Now here you can see I have two keys set up for testing my Terraform configurations. This primary C2 key is the key that I'll actually use through most of the course. To generate a new key pair, simply select Create Key Pair. Enter your key pair name, and select the format that you want to use. We're going to use PIM because that's what we want to use for OpenSSH. That's all there is to it. Simply download your key pair, store it wherever you want. All you have to do from there is chmod it with the correct permissions and use the -i flag whenever you want to SSH into your system after it's spun up. In the Terraform code, you'll see a lot of references for the primary C2 key. Remember to replace these with whatever you name your new key pair if you'd like to use your key pair instead. Alternatively, when you generate a key for this course, you could simply call it primary C2 key, and the Terraform script should already work with that key. Alright, the next thing we need to do is actually set up IAM users for our serverless framework and Terraform user. So I'm going to go to the IAM service. You can also locate that service by clicking the Services tab at the top corner and selecting IAM, but it was in my shortcut, so I just went ahead and accessed it. Now, you'll see here when you log in, you'll have your full Identity and Access Management Console. If you're logging in as your root user account like I am now, and not using a normal IAM user, I actually recommend that you run through all these security checks. It's good practice for managing your AWS account and good operational security in general. Now, obviously, I don't have an IAM password policy, and I haven't used groups to assign permissions yet, but this is just a test account for me, so I only really cared about configuring these higher priority things. Alright, so the first thing we're going to want to do is go check out our users. This is where we'll actually be able to add and create new users. So I have this test Terraform user that I'll be using throughout the course and that I usually use for testing in general. I actually use this Terraform user for both serverless framework and Terraform, and you can elect to do the same if you wish. However, it's always best to follow the principle of least privilege and make separate accounts for separate responsibilities. Normally, my Terraform user should really only need this Amazon EC2 full access permission. And that's because it's spinning up and spinning down EC2 references and resources, such as network security groups, actual EC2 boxes, and being able to access AMIs. The serverless framework actually needs quite a few permissions though. First off, it generates Lambda functions. That's the primary purpose of using it. So it'll need full access to Lambda. It'll also need full access to API Gateway and CloudFormation, as it's actually generating CloudFormation code. The IAM full access is interesting. The reason it needs IAM full access is it actually creates on-the-fly IAM roles and groups that are meant to be associated with your Lambda functions and API Gateway. So these permissions are what the serverless framework needs. Combined, I'm able to do everything throughout the course with just this test account. You can alternatively create an account that has full administrative permissions over AWS and just not worry about it if you're just wanting to test for this course. However, a key component of this course is doing things correctly. If you want to be a successful offensive security engineer, you need to know how to properly permission and configure everything, as if you are an actual system administrator or platform engineer configuring AWS, because essentially you are. So with that, I'm going to demonstrate how to make these specific users through the IAM console. You can actually do this with Terraform as well, but you have to have a Terraform user initially to do that. So for all intents and purposes, just to set up your initial users, it's probably easier just to go through the management console. So we'll go back to users, select add user, and here we'll create Terraform test. And the access type that we need is simply programmatic access. There's no reason that this user will ever need to log into the management console like we are now. It's simply a service account user that we use for automation. Next, we'll go to the permissions, and you can actually create a group out of your permissions. So I could go gather all the permissions that I typically need for Terraform or the serverless framework and create a Terraform group or a serverless group. So if I ever need to add users in the future, I could actually add them from a group here. However, since we're going to pretend that we're creating this from scratch, and because it only needs one policy, we're going to attach existing policies directly. So here's where you could elect to give it full administrator access, but we don't really need that. So we're going to search for EC2 and search for EC2 full access. Now, you can get way more granular than this. As you can see, EC2 has a lot of different access roles and permissions. If you know for a fact that your Terraform code is only going to need a few permissions, you can choose to research those permissions and add them from there. In fact, that's usually a better process, it just takes a lot longer. And in my case, when I'm configuring C2 infrastructure, I know that at some point I probably want the full capabilities to be able to add whatever I need to the C2. But of course, the more finely you grain your access controls, the more secure your user account is. So we're going to select EC2 full access for our purposes and move on to next. Here you can tag it with anything you want. If you want to add keywords or anything like that, so it's more easily searchable and sortable, you absolutely can. I don't want to do that in my case, so I'm just going to move on to the review. This is just showing us an overview of what we're creating, making sure it's correct. Then we'll hit create user. And now it'll generate our access keys. So here I'm actually going to show you how to configure your access keys. So when I do this, you're actually going to get to see the full credentials for this user. Keep in mind that these credentials will no longer be valid, and you should never share your credentials or access keys, especially to these critical service accounts. This is just for demonstration, and this user, of course, will be purged as soon as I'm done with this demonstration. So I'm going to show my secret access key, and I am going to leave this here for now because I'm going to come back to it to copy. At this point, you should probably store your keys in some kind of password manager, because if you ever lose access to the credential file we're about to generate, you'll lose those keys forever and have to rotate them out and generate new keys. If you're using this user account in multiple places where there's automation in place, then you're probably going to have to change it there too. It just becomes a whole headache, but you should probably periodically rotate your keys anyway. You just don't want to accidentally lose them. Now, one prerequisite for this is to install the AWS CLI tool. You can get it directly from Amazon, and I'll of course have links to it in the reference material. I already have it installed here, so I'm going to run a simple AWS configure. Here we can actually enter our access keys. So we'll copy the access key ID and the access key secret. Here we have the option to give it a default region and a default output format. We're just going to leave it as the default nones because we don't really need them. Now, what that just did is configured a .aws folder in your home directory. This folder contains a config file and credentials, so let's look at those. Our config file is pretty much empty because we didn't need anything, but our credentials file now holds our access ID and our secret key. You can actually configure this file with multiple users, as we'll see momentarily. This is important because you can have multiple users with multiple profiles that you switch across from different tools. Now, something important to note from an attacker perspective is if you ever are hunting for credentials on a system, look for that .aws folder. These are plain text credentials to access service accounts in AWS. Very important information that you can gather to compromise further systems. Okay, so now that we have that account set up, we're actually done here. And now we're ready to add another user. Now I'm going to go back to our Terraform user in a new tab and reference this user, because I need to know what permissions Lambda is going to need. So for Terraform, we only needed EC2 full access. But for the serverless framework user, we're going to need Lambda full access, IAM full access, the API gateway admin, and AWS CloudFormation. So we'll have this as a reference in case I get to that step and forget. So I'll add a user now. We'll call it serverless test. And from there, it's the same type of thing. Give it programmatic access, and then attach existing policies directly. This would be a great example of an account to create a group of permissions on, because we have so many. But just like before, we're just going to manually add these because we're only doing it one time right now. So we'll give it AWS Lambda full access. Then we need IAM full access. And again, as you go down into these permissions, you can actually see that there are several unique permissions, and you can fine-grain this to the specificity that you need for your service accounts. Then I believe the next thing we had was API Gateway and CloudFormation. Let's double check. Looks like everything should be good. Skip our tags because we don't want them for this temporary user. And now we can review the user account. Looks like we do have all the permissions that we should need. So we'll create our user. And now we have the access key and access ID. So I'm going to go back to our credentials file and make a couple modifications. So our default profile is for the Terraform user. We'll leave this as is, but you can actually call it Terraform and refer to it as Terraform if you would like. That's important because when you're selecting profiles, you could totally have a different default access key and then explicitly specify these user accounts whenever you want. I'm going to leave the Terraform as the default user for now, so that way when I run Terraform commands, I don't have to specify a profile, but when I run the serverless framework, I will have to specify a profile. To specify a profile, the syntax is extremely simple. Default is a profile, so it's exactly the same. I put in a bracket, and I'll call this serverless. I've now created the serverless profile. Next, I need to specify the same parameters as in the default. I need an AWS access key. So I'll specify AWS access key ID. And now I will go get that access key ID and paste it in. Now I need to give my AWS secret. So I'll specify the secret access key. And copy that as well. Now I'll simply save this file. And just like that, our user accounts are now all created and valid. So now when we use the serverless framework in Terraform, we can specify the appropriate profiles. With the default profile, we actually don't have to specify anything. To specify a profile in serverless framework, you can actually use the --AWS-profile commands and simply give it the name of the profile. In our case, it would be serverless. Again, I want to reiterate that you're seeing these credentials on my screen because these are test accounts that will be purged. Never share these credentials with anyone. These are secrets. This is basically a username and password. There aren't many tutorials on the internet showing off these things because it can be kind of risky to set up a test environment if you're not absolutely sure that you don't have any real keys on your system while recording a video. So many people, to avoid risk, just skip this step and assume you know how to do it. This makes a lot of tutorials difficult and is exactly why I wanted to put this primer section in. These are all the steps that you need to follow to correctly configure and use the Terraform scripts and serverless code that's provided with this course. Of course, if you would like to make things simpler for your testing, you can create a single user that has all of these roles and access permissions and leave that as your default. From then, whenever you run Terraform or serverless commands, you don't have to specify a profile. Lastly, of course, just to show that, one, I am deleting these accounts, and to show you how to delete an account and how easy it is, simply check the accounts you want and click Delete Users. If you are electing to use AWS throughout the rest of this course, I hope this primer was helpful in getting you set up. That concludes this lecture. We'll see you in the next one.